Bob Ezrin was brought in to produce us. He was Canadian and had been successful with the Alice Cooper albums. Needless to say, we were fans of his work. He brought with him something we had never seen before. He had vision. He knew before the album was recorded what it should be. He rearranged songs. He co-wrote half-finished songs. He told Peter how to play his drums. He literally came up with the melody line for the entire solo of Detroit Rock City. He made Ace play every note and stick on the harmony parts. He suggested my bass line in the song. Neither Ace nor Peter was thrilled with the notion that some outsider was now telling them what to play, but the results speak for themselves. All the major decisions on the entire record, the sound loops, the children's choir, the kids on God of Thunder, Ezrin's kids, by the way, the string-based Beth, and the song order were completely Ezrin's. We started recording in the record plant in New York in January of '76, only 5 months after the release of Alive. Up until we met Bob Ezrin, we were leery of letting anybody else have a say as to what we should record. That included management, record companies, producers, anybody. Bob Ezrin was the first and continues to be the only producer who ever really had an effect on the band.
You really like my limousine. You like the way the wheels roll. You like my 7-inch leather heels and going to all of the shows.
It's hard to say why we let Bob have so much control, yet it's also easy. It wasn't about his track record. It's never about a track record. It's more about the fact that when somebody has an idea and can communicate that idea as effectively as Bob, they automatically command a certain respect. Other bands have stories about meeting up with producers who teach them how to be professionals. Before these producers came along, they were noble savages, beating on their guitars and just hoping for the best. It wasn't like that with Kiss. We had known what we were doing since the beginning. Bob didn't make us go faster. In fact, if anything, he slowed the process down considerably. But it was the way he slowed it down that was impressive. At one point, I remember him stopping us in the middle of a rehearsal. "Okay," he said, "do you guys know how to tune your instruments?" We were all self-taught musicians. We said, "Of course, here's how you tune them." He frowned. "No," he said, "there's another way to tune instruments, which is pitch perfect. It's called harmonic tuning." And he showed us how to do it, which we had never seen in our lives. It was like going back to school or to summer camp. He carried a whistle around, and whenever he wanted to get our attention, he would say, "Campers?" Every time we thought we had done enough to satisfy him, he would come at us with something else. In some ways, he was quite a disciplinarian. When he didn't think we were getting a handle on something, he would send us outside the studio. Paul and I were excited because we knew the experience was making the band better. We were rubbing our hands together thinking, "Oh boy, this is going to a place we haven't been." It was a really good adventure because we recognized that whatever we were doing, even though it was a step forward, it still sounded like Kiss, but better than before. We literally heard the record coming together there in the studio, and it was the best version of the band to that point.
Early in 1976, when we were getting ready to make our next studio album, Bill Aucoin said, "You can either use Kiss Alive as a springboard to take you to another level, or you can be a one-hit wonder that just goes right back to doing what you were doing before." He had a point. The reason our first 3 albums didn't sell was because listeners didn't like the way they sounded. There was something intrinsically wrong with them, though I still couldn't have put my finger on exactly what it was. Bill suggested we bring in Bob Ezrin to produce the new record. Bob was already known for the great records he'd made with Alice Cooper, and he proved to have a vast musical vocabulary. It turned out to be a brilliant move on Bill's part. Bob was a gift. We may have had a huge album under our belts, but we still didn't know anything more than we did before Alive became a hit. Still, for a bunch of guys who thought they were hot shit, it was initially jarring to go into a studio with someone who treated us like children. As we began work on what would become Destroyer, Bob made a point of letting us know he was the boss. He wore a whistle around his neck and referred to us as campers. He told us we didn't know anything, which was true. He told us never to stop playing until he said so. Once at the end of a take, long after a fade-out would have ended the recording, Gene stopped playing. Bob came out of the control room and ran up to him, stuck his finger so close to Gene's nose that it made his eyes cross, and said, "Don't you ever stop until I tell you to stop." A trickle of sweat ran down Gene's forehead. He never stopped again. It was humbling, particularly at a time when we thought we were God's gift to rock and roll and finally had a record to back up our claim. Alive was platinum by this point. But Bob clearly knew a lot more than we did. He was trained, he was worthy of respect, and he taught us a lot. One of the most significant things he did was challenge us not to write "fuck me, suck me" songs. No more "I'm a rock star, suck my dick," he insisted. And as we worked on lyrics, he had no problem saying very plainly, "No, I don't like that." I would never have written a lyric like Detroit Rock City without Bob upping our game. He pushed us far beyond our limits. During the process of making the record, Bob lived in an apartment directly across the street from my place on 52nd Street. He had a piano, and when we weren't in the rehearsal space or studio, I spent a lot of time there. Gene and I also sometimes took amplifiers over to his place and worked. We wrote Shout It Out Loud at Bob's apartment. The riff in God of Thunder reflected the way my limitations as a guitar player were key to what I came up with and probably helped make my songs identifiable and unique. That riff was a compromise between what I heard in my head and what I could actually play. Another example of that process was I Want You, which ended up on the next album. Sometimes at the rehearsal space, Bob would have the four of us sit in a circle and he would say, "Who's got an idea? Anybody have an idea for a verse? Who's got a part?" Someone would play a snippet and he might say, "No." Then somebody else would play something and Bob would shout, "Okay, that's good. Now who has another part?" A lot of the songs came together like that, pieces of this and that stitched together with input from Bob. Peter sat at his drums while we threw out ideas. When it came time to arrange finished songs, Bob often came up with parts. Once I saw him work with us, I understood Alice Cooper's albums much more. I could see Bob's point of view in them. Bob's fingerprints were all over things like Billion Dollar Babies. Suddenly, I could hear his drum parts and his bass parts. I knew them from our stuff, like the bass line in Detroit Rock City, which Bob created. Bob even came up with the guitar solo on Detroit Rock City. He sang it to Ace and made him figure it out. Bob was brilliant at that kind of stuff.
Much of the success of Destroyer had to do with Bob's bravery, particularly his interest in introducing new elements into our music. Bob's children would come in. He was going through a divorce at the time, and they actually wound up as the little voices in God of Thunder. He was doing all kinds of things, like having symphony orchestras and choirs. What George Martin was to the Beatles, Bob Ezrin was to us. He had something that we had never seen before in a producer, a vision. He knew where he was going within the confines of what Kiss was, and most important, he knew how to get there. While Paul and I had perspective and vision, we didn't quite know how to get there, because we were limited as musicians. There was one thing we did know, though. We wanted to create an experience that went beyond the experiences that other rock bands were creating. Bob really listened to our songs and recognized that we were less about storytelling than about singing about our own feelings and perceptions. I'm the king of the nighttime world. I want to rock and roll all night. That was a quantum difference. I am the God of Thunder. These were the kinds of statements we specialized in, and they differentiated us from other bands. When we spoke to Bob about this, he realized that the simplicity and self-absorption in the lyrics was purposeful, that we were a band with a distinct point of view rather than just a set of guys who didn't have a clue. We wanted to write anthems, songs that felt like the theme songs for a generation, songs that had a you and me against the world perspective. As much as Paul and I loved working with Bob, Ace and Peter hated it. For the first time, they couldn't take the easy way out. Ace was not about discipline. He wouldn't even show up on time. and nobody had ever sat Peter down and said, "Here is a 2 and a 4. He has never been able to articulate his own playing. Give me a 1 and a 3 on a kick, and a 2 and a 4 on the snare. He wouldn't have a clue what that meant, and to this day he doesn't know what a 2 or a 4 is. Peter has always played by feel and couldn't play the same thing twice. As a result, Bob Ezrin's time with the band was very tough for Ace and Peter, or at least that's how they saw it. Peter, in particular, was devastated by it. He had never had any discipline. He was a street kid. Paul and I had always been critical of Ace and Peter because they didn't get the big picture, and here was this guy from the outside doing the same thing, only 10 times more intensely. Paul and I used to talk about who was taking the experience harder. In retrospect, I think both of them were feeling quite defeated, although their feelings manifested in different ways. Peter would come out furious that somebody was telling him what to play, or how to sing, and that's not rock and roll. It was the same personality that made him threaten to leave the band if we didn't include his Strange Ways solo back in '74. Ace would simply leave. Sometimes he wouldn't show up at recording sessions. On one occasion, he wanted to leave early because he had a card game at 7 that evening. At some point, Bob didn't worry about Ace or his excuses. He simply got another guitar player to come in and play Ace's parts. Mainly, he was a guy called Dick Wagner, who played with the Lou Reed Band. He was not credited, and to this day, people think it's Ace on the album. Ace felt as if Paul and I especially were traitors, and that we told Bob Ezrin to get another guitar player because we never wanted him in the band anyway. Yet we were the ones who brought him into the band, pushed him to write his own songs, and asked him to be more than a guitar player and sing his own songs. He was oblivious to that and continues to be. During the recording of Destroyer in 1975, I had another drug experience. Not an experience in which I took a drug, but the first time I ever saw cocaine cut up and ready to be snorted. A mirror was built into the control console at the recording studio, and I was clueless about its purpose. I kept on saying, "Look how stupid this is. You have to bend down to see your face." The least they could do is hang it up on the wall, and everybody would laugh. But nobody ever told me what it was for. At the time, I was using Sweet and Low in my coffee because I've always loved desserts but wanted to lose weight. One day I walked in, and there was powder on the mirror. And I was so oblivious to everything about drugs that I assumed it was Sweet and Low. I made myself some coffee, and I brushed some of the stuff on the console into my cup. Then I thought twice about it and said to myself, "That's probably got some dirt and stuff." One of the engineers explained it to me. "No, that's cocaine. You cut it up. You snort it with a straw." "That's stupid," I said. It seemed so stupid to me, in fact, that I actually took Sweet and Low and spread it on the control console. I don't know if anybody took it or not, but I thought that was a funny thing at the time.
My love spit tight around me. My whip has always been beside me. You want the same thing every day. I'll teach you love a different way. You learn to love me and my sweet hey. My love will drive you insane.
While we were recording Destroyer, we spent a lot of time in the studio, more than we ever had. During the course of those sessions, I'd be plugging one of the girls who worked there. I would say, "Excuse me, guys, I gotta go pee," and slip away to fuck her pants off. On one occasion, I snuck her into a vocal booth and laid her down. I ravenously went at her, and she at me, until she stopped, patted me on the back, and pointed to the window portal. Ezrin and the band had seen the whole thing. Paul then got the message and started doing her. We were on swing shift. car crashing at the beginning of Detroit Rock City was a sound effect Ezrin brought in. Initially, some of us thought it was a bit melodramatic. Though we knew movies used sound effects with songs, we simply never thought about using the sound of crashing cars to open a song. But while recently listening to the Shangri-La's Leader of the Pack, sure enough, I heard a motorcycle crash in the background. After Kiss played a concert in Flint, Michigan in 1975, Peter and I were in a limousine together, and he was trying to sing something he called Beck, about a girl named Becky. I suggested that he change the name to Beth, both because it was a little easier to sing and because it would eliminate any misunderstanding that it was about Jeff Beck. Peter brought this nice little melody into the studio and sang it for Bob. Immediately, Bob sat down and fleshed it out. He had a much wider musical library than any of us. He listened to jazz, to classical, to country. He stuck in a middle eight from a Mozart piano concerto, rewrote the lyric, and suddenly we had a song. But we really didn't know what to do with it. Rock bands didn't do ballads, least of all in the midst of a concerted push for rock and roll credibility. The only way we validated the idea that there were strings on it was because of Yesterday by the Beatles. If it was cool for the Beatles, then we could do it. The first few singles from Destroyer hadn't done quite as well as we wanted. Shout It Out Loud was the first single, and it got into the top 40. Then the label released Flamin' Youth with a special picture disc, but that only got to number 74. The third single was Detroit Rock City with Beth, this strange, unclassifiable ballad on the B-side. We had high hopes for Detroit Rock City, but it didn't even chart, and the album, which had reached as high as number 11 and sold about 850,000 copies, was beginning to taper off.
Beth, I hear you calling, but I can't come home right now. Me and the boys are playing, and we just can't find the sound. Just a few more hours, and I'll be right home to you. I think I hear them calling. Oh, Beth, what can I do? Beth, what can I do? You say you feel so empty, that our house just ain't a home, that I'm always somewhere else, and you're always there alone. Just a few more hours, and I'll be right home to you. I think I hear them calling. Oh, Beth, what can I do? What can I do?
That's when something strange started to happen. Radio stations turned over the record and started playing Beth instead of Detroit Rock City, and it quickly became a huge hit. Beth was a breakthrough single, establishing the record. Now, rather than having a hit with a live record and then sinking back down, we were riding the crest of two massive hit records. In pop music, this has been the way to create superstars from stars. And sure enough, we were superstars. Soon after Destroyer came out, we played our first stadium.
If I know you're lonely, and I hope you'll be alright, 'cause me and the boys will be playing all night.
Beth was written by Stan Penridge mostly. It was credited to Peter Criss, Stan Penridge, and Bob Ezrin. In truth, Peter didn't play a musical instrument, drums or a percussive instrument, and I have never seen him write a single song. Peter may have contributed a line of lyric or two, but after hearing the original Penridge demo tape of the song, it's clear who came up with the original song. As a side note, Peter was having a hard time getting the vocal performance down. His pitch wasn't to Ezrin's satisfaction. Ezrin made the band leave the studio to give Peter a chance to concentrate. Eventually the track was done, and we all stared at each other. There were no guitars played by the band on it. There were no drums on it, and Ace never showed up to play his part. In a very real way, Beth is simply Peter singing alone. There is not another piece of Kiss on there. We didn't know if it would upset the fans.
When it came time for the drums, we faced a real challenge. Bob spent many hours teaching Peter his parts. Bob came up with most of the drum parts on the album, and he would dismiss the rest of us for hours at a time to work with Peter. Detroit Rock City in particular had a very challenging drum beat, and it took a lot of effort and patience for Bob to get Peter to be able to play something he couldn't have learned to play on his own if his life had depended on it. Back then, there were no click tracks, which allow a drummer to work with a sort of metronome to get a consistent tempo. But to get a track the way he wanted it, Bob liked to be able to cut and splice from various takes we recorded, which necessitated a steady pace. That would have been difficult in our case, to say the least, so Bob created a human click track. He sat in the control room with a mic stuck into a hole in a cigar box and tapped the beat on the box and fed it to all of us, most importantly, Peter. Bob also wrote the lion's share of Beth, using a few lines and a melody Peter brought in. Peter had a co-writer on every song he ever wrote because he couldn't really write. Song structure and concepts like making your lyrics rhyme were totally lost on him. In the case of Beth, Bob wrote most of it, even though the original idea Peter brought in had already been done with a co-writer. To get the vocal for Beth, Bob had to record Peter singing the song probably a dozen times and cobble together a single version from the passable parts of those takes. Peter's chances of being able to sing a song off the cuff were about as good as my chances of throwing a penny and hitting the moon. It would be a challenge for him to carry a tune in a bucket. Even if we sang a note to him, he couldn't find it. But since we had always presented our Beatles-based fantasy to the world, 4 band members all contributing equally, at some point Peter began to believe his own press. Perception became reality to him, despite the fact that we created the perception ourselves. We made it out as if we lived like the Help-era Beatles and all made music together as equals. But that was never the case. And who should know that better than the people who were actually there and not contributing? Peter and Ace's contributions were never as substantial as we made them out to be in the press. The fact of the matter was that 2 guys, Gene and me, were the engineers and motivators and did 80% of the work. Unfortunately, when we decided to create the Help illusion, we never considered the possibility that Peter and Ace would start to actually believe it and that their belief would bite us in the ass. But sure enough, their delusion started to create resentment and eventually fatal fissures in the band. Those fissures first started opening during Destroyer, as Peter struggled to record a song that was ostensibly his own, and we began to have to work around Ace, who spent much of the recording process with his priorities far from where they belonged. He sometimes played his parts with his rings and chains scraping against the fretboard and pickups and then wanted to quit for the day and take off. When I would ask him to remove the jewelry and do another take because of all the noise, he would say, "Hey, that's rock and roll. No, Ace, that's shit." His alcohol abuse is well documented, but Ace also didn't hesitate to just up and leave the studio to go play cards with friends. I could not wrap my head around that at all. Leaving the job to get loaded and play cards, even if it meant having another guitar player handle his parts? Making music was my dream, and skipping out on that process was something I couldn't fathom. Sonically, Bob Ezrin didn't try to recreate the bombast of Alive with its huge broken-up guitars and screaming vocals. He found power in other ways. He created an atmosphere of grandeur. He brought in elements of things I loved, like the orchestral bells on Do You Love Me. He gave guitar chords heft by layering them with a grand piano playing the same parts. In some ways, it reminded me of what I liked about Roy Wood and Wizard, that big, chaotic version of Phil Spector's Wall of Sound. Bob added things that really struck emotional chords in me. He was also the first producer we worked with who finally understood the subtleties we didn't understand about using different guitars for different parts, or doubling a guitar with a different guitar, or slowing down the tape slightly and doubling the guitar over it to make the sound bigger because of the slight discrepancy in the tuning. Bob knew the essence of great production and great arrangements, and he brought it to bear on Destroyer in a way I thought was groundbreaking for the type of music we made. Wow, this is what a real producer does. From that point on, unless someone could tell us what was wrong with what we were doing and how to correct it, whether it was a problem with the song itself or with the sonics, I considered that person an engineer, not a producer.
Okay?
God of Thunder was written by Paul. Most people think I wrote it. It was originally recorded in a demo form at Magna Graphics Studios in New York on 8-track with Paul singing and a disco beat. Ezrin rearranged the song, slowed it down, and suggested I sing it instead. Paul, to his credit, was very receptive.
You got something about you. You got something I need. Daughter of Aphrodite, we'll make love to a sea.
Both Paul and I would offer our songs to be sung by Ace and Peter. Paul in particular gave a few songs to Peter to sing. God of Thunder became my signature song for years. In what must have been an inspirational moment, I decided I should throw up blood during the beginning of the song so that I could look the part. Destroyer was released and initially stalled at sales of around 890,000 copies. We were on tour, and although the fans came out in droves to see their heroes, the record just stood still. Then Beth became a hit and everything around us exploded. We were invited to do the Paul Lynde Halloween special, which meant national television exposure. We appeared on the show with Margaret Hamilton, the original witch from The Wizard of Oz. We also noticed that the world had changed. All of a sudden, you could walk down the street, and people would be walking by wearing Kiss t-shirts. We had arrived. Ezrin's recording style was leagues beyond anything we had seen. In some ways, it seemed like a throwback to a previous era. But in other ways, it was clear he knew what he wanted and how to get it. Records are recorded by separating all the different elements into tracks. You can move a fader and only hear the guitar, or the snare drum. Once everything was recorded on a 24-track machine, you then added effects like echo or chorus and mixed it down to a stereo mix. What you hear at home is a mix. Ezrin would record 2 or 3 guitars, add effects, and submix them, which means there was no turning back. He would commit to a sound very early on. It further solidified the notion in my mind that he had a vision.
My parents think I'm crazy, and they hate the things I do. I'm stupid and I'm lazy, man, if they only knew.
Destroyer also marked the first time we tried experimentation. Peter's drum set was set up in the loading area in back of the studio for one of the tracks. His drums faced an open elevator shaft. Microphones were placed close to the drums and at the end of the elevator shaft. That way, the sound would come back like thunder. Peter was separated from the rest of us, so a video camera was set up to film him. This was still at the early stages of video, so it all seemed very science fiction to us. On one of the takes, Peter stopped playing, and when we looked up, there was a guy carrying out the garbage into the elevator nearby. Flaming Youth was probably the most difficult song to record. It was composed of a title Paul had, which he lifted from a band we had opened up for called Flaming Youth. A verse and a chorus that Ezrin, Paul, and I tossed back and forth, and a bass riff I had from an old song called Mad Dog.
You've got to please her. You still believe her. She's just a teaser.
Ezrin put all the pieces together and then threw a bizarre time signature at us, which was torture for a basic drummer like Peter. Peter never counted bars of time. He had never done it and, in fact, didn't understand the fundamentals. Ezrin had to start from the beginning. Where was the 1 and where was the 2? And then he had to teach Peter in particular what a bar of music was, how long it lasted, and how one counted it. He also tried to crystallize what a chorus and a verse were. All this education made Peter very irritable. It was also very time-intensive. We were used to going into the studio, not thinking too much about technicalities, and just doing it. We had never encountered anything like this. Kiss was a rock and roll band. We were unschooled, self-taught musicians. We got through the song, but it had to be done in pieces and then edited together. Shout It Out Loud was written in Ezrin's apartment. Paul and I had gone over to play new material. Ezrin sat down at the piano. Paul had a guitar and suggested a few changes. When there was a basic verse idea, I suggested shout it out loud, as in shout it, shout it, shout it out loud. This wasn't a unique idea. Wicked Lester had recorded a song we never put on the album called We Want to Shout It Out Loud, written by Cook and Greenaway. The demo was originally done by the Hollies. They never used it. We tried to record it, but it never made it to the final stages. I had always loved the notion of shouting anything, as in Shout, by the Isley Brothers. Shout It Out Loud seemed like a natural follow-up to Rock and Roll All Night, where Rock and Roll All Night proudly proclaimed I wanna as the key idea. Shout It brought the fans into the party. Well, the party's begun and you want some fun.
Shout it, shout it, shout it out loud. Shout it, shout it, shout it out loud.
Great Expectations was a song I had written initially about the band. The original lyric went something like, you watch Paul playing guitar, and you see what his hand can do, and you wish you were the one he was doing it to. And you watch me singing this song, and you know what my mouth can do, and you wish you were the one I was doing it to. Ezrin thought the song was too self-serving if it talked about the band, although Beth was very clearly about the band. Beth, I hear you calling, but I can't come home right now, 'cause me and the boys will be playing all night. I would have preferred to have the band names mentioned in the song. I had fondly remembered Beatles songs and hearing, Take It, George.
You're sitting in your seat, and then you stand and clutch your breast. Our music drives you wild along with the rest. You watch me singing the song. You see what my mouth can do, and you wish you were the one I was doing it to. And you watch me playing guitar, and you feel what my fingers can do, and you wish you were the one I was doing it to. Well, listen, you've got great expectations. You've got great expectations.
When Destroyer came out, Kiss became the biggest band in America. We went from opening up for other bands to headlining at Anaheim Stadium in California, with opening acts like Bob Seger, Uriah Heep, and Ted Nugent. We had billboard and television commercials. Coming soon were the Kiss makeup kits and lunchboxes. While almost every record we recorded in our 30-year history has elements I would change, in retrospect, Destroyer is an album I wouldn't change. I might do away with the sound loop at the top of the first song, but other than that, I wouldn't change a thing. Kiss has played thousands of concerts. We have added and dropped songs from our set list purely as a response to what the fans seem to like. Destroyer has stood the test of time. More than any other record we ever recorded, it probably defines what the band is and what it stood for. The songs on it, Detroit Rock City, Shout It Out Loud, God of Thunder, and others, continue to be a staple of our live shows. Anaheim Stadium in California, which held 55,000 fans. If it hadn't happened to us, we wouldn't have believed it. This was early 1976, only 2 years after we released our first record, and there we were playing stadiums before anyone other than the Beatles had. Bands that had been around for almost a decade, including Ted Nugent and Bob Seger, were opening for us. We knew something was going on. It was clear. The first burst of fame coincided with the first wave of Kiss merchandise. I had always seen the band as a means to an end. In my mind, making music was only part of the plan. The master plan was to create a cultural institution that was as iconic as Disney. From the very beginning, we were at the forefront of rock and roll merchandising. We had the usual products like T-shirts and posters, but we also had an interest in expanding into other markets. We grew to the point that Bill Aucoin actually bought a share in a company called Boutwell, and we wound up in manufacturing. Warehouses in the Southern California Valley were manufacturing our own T-shirts, belt buckles, and stuff. Mail-order forms were enclosed inside the records. We did things other bands wouldn't have had the balls to do. The same things you see when you buy Time magazine. There's an order form inside. From the start, we didn't care that it invalidated what we did. We were not concerned with credibility. It just looked like a lot of fun. As time went on, some bands took a stand against this kind of thing. Primarily, they came from the big art rock movement in New York. We always thought they were geeks. It was as if all of a sudden the guys who never got laid in school put guitars around their necks. They didn't count for us. They didn't look like stars, they looked like students, and they always talked about stuff we couldn't care less about. Burning buildings? What are you talking about? All of a sudden, we were one of the biggest bands in the world. In the mid-'70s, a lot of the bands we grew up with were not exactly at their peak. The Stones were not. The Who were not. And we were outselling them more than 2-1. Bands like Queen were huge worldwide, but in America they didn't tour much. We didn't have many peers. At that time, misinformation about the band began to spread in the southern Bible Belt states, including a rumor that the name Kiss stood for Knights in Satan's Service, and that the four of us were devil worshippers. Ironically, this rumor started as a result of an interview I gave in Circus magazine after our first album. In response to a question, I said that I sometimes wondered what human flesh tastes like. I never wanted to really find out, but I was curious intellectually. Later on, this comment seemed to ignite the whole idea that in some way Kiss was aligned with devil worship. When I was asked whether I worshiped the devil, I simply refused to answer for a number of reasons. The first reason, of course, was that it was good press. Let people wonder. The second reason was my complete disregard for the people who were asking. The religious fanatics who were asking these questions didn't deserve the time of day. The uneducated always point to religious principles. Through the years, whenever religious fanatics accosted me, especially in the southern states, and quoted the Old Testament to me, I would quote them back chapter and verse. They didn't know that I had been a theology major in school. An idiot is an idiot, whether he quotes the Bible or not. Fueling the fire for the Satan-worshipping nonsense was my hand signal, which involved the pinky, the thumb, and the index finger. This started innocently enough during concerts. I'd hold the pick with my thumb and my two middle fingers. Some people mistakenly thought it was a gesture of some kind, so they started waving their index and pinky fingers toward me in return. The second part of the hand signal came from my love of Spider-Man. In the comics, he sometimes had his middle finger pressed against the inside of his palm. I copied that in an early photo, and the fundamentalists seized on it. In point of fact, the hand signal actually means I love you in sign language, though I didn't know that at the time. This hand signal, ironically enough, became a standard gesture for other heavy metal bands and their fans, and it has been in constant circulation ever since.